All right, well, here's our official start. So welcome to the San Diego Central Library. My name's Bonnie Domingos. I run the visual arts program here at the library. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for our online viewers tuning in tonight for today's special guest, Keith York, but also this enlightening conversation with focusing on James Hubbell and his collaborations with Sim Bruce Richards. But to start us off tonight, I'd like to introduce Mary Ann Gerdes with the Lana Lell Foundation, executive director, who's going to say a few words on Jim tonight. So welcome, Mary Ann.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I imagine most of you have heard the news that Jim passed away last Friday. It's a terrible loss to all of us who know him and have worked with him, but it's also a loss to all of us, to this whole community, because of what he represents to all of us. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for being here tonight. It makes tonight's presentation with Keith even a little more special, more important, because Keith is one of the legacy keepers of Jim's history and knows quite a bit about this period of Jim's life, or this work that Jim has done in architecture. You know, Jim was not an architect. He was a designer, an artist, and yet he was a trained sculptor, so he had that idea of how to create architecture that felt like you were inside of a sculpture, inside of a seashell, in the case of the Boys' House, for example. We've been planning, knew this day would be coming, and so the foundation is already well on its way, the Yolande Leal Foundation, to carrying forward Jim's legacy and continuing his work. We have plans to build more Pacific Rim parks and to carry forward the Yolande Leal property and keep that open for people to come and be inspired by the art and by the nature, to learn art there, to experience all of the wonderful things that Jim did, the inspiration, the peace, and the beauty of what nature has to offer us. So that and many other new programs and will be coming forth in the years to come. So we hope that you'll stay with us, that you'll continue to support Jim's work. Just in one little aside, we maintain an archive of his work that has over 17,000 pieces in it. And so there's a whole lot of art of Jim's that you still haven't seen, and we'll be sharing with you over the year as the years come forward. So thanks for being here. Thanks for your support in the past and your ongoing support for Yolande Leal. And now I'll bring on Keith York.
Hi, everyone. There needs to be a username and a password to access this computer all of a sudden.
Here, you go in front.
All right. This is my trusty assistant, Bonnie. For starters, thank you, Mary Ann. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I hope you've all visited the exhibition, at least at this site, if not the other library sites. This talk tonight follows my friend and colleague Dave Hampton's talk on Jim's early work in early years a few weeks ago, also live streamed out there for those watching tonight, maybe. And you good?
Yeah, you want a PowerPoint or a PDF?
PowerPoint, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Any questions? Anyone want to warm up the room a little bit?
Are any of the previous talks on YouTube or anything that we missed?
Dave, I believe Dave's talk from a couple weeks ago is available on YouTube. This will be housed on YouTube as well. So for those that missed tonight or you want to watch it again, I have no understanding why, but you're more than welcome to. Yay! Okay. So tonight, kind of riffing off of what Mary Ann said, I had the good fortune of spending a good deal of time with Jim and Ann, certainly Mary Ann and Drew. I helped a little bit working on a film that Mary Ann did on Jim and the property in San Isabel. But then subsequent to all that loving time and amazing experiences that I had, a separate part of my interests in life turned to the work of Bruce Richards. And so tonight is the kind of the coming together of both of those seemingly parallel lives, but very much a life or a friendship, collaborations that were decades in the making. This is a picture of Bruce towards the end of his life. And what you'll see a couple times throughout tonight's talk are some quotes that I found help define and help explain to those that may not know their relationship, maybe shed a little bit of light. So the first quote is kind of fun. "The architect fails when his building does not include the participation of all the five senses of man. The architect must think of the artist as another tool, not a mechanical one, but a tool with an idea." And in this case, he is actually speaking to Jim, about Jim. "The exuberant imagination of an artist craftsman like Hubbell can add or better integrate a playful note to the architect's design and make his house sing and dance and yet behave." Bruce, as an architect, published this in a San Diego magazine called OmniArt. It was published by the local chapter of the American Institute of Architects. And he did this whole piece on his work with Jim, and that was in this large, italicized, beautiful font throughout the article. And it was funny because in the first paragraph, he talks about the artist as a noun. In the second paragraph, he really starts talking about his friend Jim. One of my first experiences with any of this was 20 years ago. I don't know the actual math. I visited this home, which is now, thankfully, my home. And this is Janet and Bruce Richards' house, their personal residence in Point Loma. And this resin window, sort of on the right, is by Jim. It's signed. It is dated 1957 at the completion of the house. Many people that come over ask me where I bought it or how it got later added, because it looks like it should be a clear glass window facing the street. But the joy of this particular window is that if you're outside at sunrise, it glows because it is facing east. So the other side of that pane of glass is the eastern sunrise. And when we're in the house at sunset, it glows from the outside. So there's this two ways of reading this actually wonderful resin panel. I'll talk about it a little bit more, but I just kind of want to lay the groundwork for how I've come to be here in front of you tonight. This is when you walk through the front door and you turn left. This is the living room view. I wake up every morning and I sit in that chair with the pillow and I start my day with a cup of coffee and I begin working and navigating, planning for the day. As lovely as this photograph is, what used to sit there outside that glass pane were these two wonderful works by Jim. And so prior to my ownership of this house, I used to come visit the house and I would see these two wonderful pieces that brought in the eastern sunrise. I'm going to get the door. Oh, Marianne? Okay. We have a late visitor. And so I love the photographs. I think Dave included photographs. There's a wonderful genesis of these works that used to kind of bring the sunrise through these pieces into the living room of my home. One of the things that you all probably know is Jim was and always has been throughout his life since he was a boy an artist. And what fewer people know is that Bruce Richards was an artist first and an architect second. So as in his late teens, which he's standing here, he's about, what is he? He's about 16 or 17 years old in this picture. And that's Melanie Murdoch, his weaving instructor. And this is taken in Phoenix. There's a long history to who she was and the work she produced. A little bit of acclaim during her lifetime, but people have now, since her passing years and years ago, recognized she was really a master weaver. And she brought together, I'd say, influences of Western Europe, Scandinavia, but in her weavings were a lot of Native American, obviously around the Phoenix area, and then she got really interested in Mayan and Aztec work. So she started incorporating all of these different cultures into her textiles, and she and Bruce did shows together where, as a late teen and early 20-something, he was showing alongside her instructor. By the time he went to Berkeley, you can't see it. This is one of my favorite photos, even though it's sort of a weird photo. He's on the left at an easel talking to what we presume is his instructor. The young woman in the middle is a friend of his, and the man with his hands in his pocket are actually, that's his roommate, Blaine Drake, who would later go on to work with Frank Lloyd Wright as well. So he was doing a lot of painting. The family still holds in their collection a number of his paintings from as early as the 1930s. After graduation, he did a lot of carving in a very Frank Lloyd Wrightian tradition, a lot of geometries that evoke what we all think of as Wrightian geometries. He also did this one project. It was the original intent was for the 1939 World's Fair in New York, but he sandblasted this set of glassware. Where those are has been a great mystery to myself and the family. But I'm trying to illustrate that he went from painting to carving to glass work to large-scale mural work. He worked with Martha Graham, who is with that really interesting hat in the middle. And this mural in 1939 was for the Arizona State Teachers College, which has now been subsumed by Arizona State University. The building was demolished many, many years ago. No one knows when or if these murals ever survived past that demolition. But he became friendly with Martha Graham, who was touring the country with her dance troupe. And if you really explicate this photo in greater detail, what all these figures are the contemporary dance choreographers of the era. And there's a sort of a caricature of each of the women choreographers, and then their name is next to it. So Graham is the figure sort of in the center with her arm raised, and then she's obviously in the foreground of the photo. By 1940, Bruce is exhibiting his paintings and drawings and textiles, mural work, and even furniture design, mostly in the Phoenix area before he moves to San Diego. So I kind of want to lay the groundwork that Bruce, though he spent his entire life, I should say, post 30 years of age as an architect, his early life was bound in the arts. And when Jim and I had one of many conversations, he gave me this quote, and I remember writing it down. I still have the notes from that lunch, that he said, I think the reason Bruce and I got along so well together and our work was so compatible was because, well, first of all, we respected each other, which was essential. And secondly, we liked to play. I think for Bruce, life was fun and designing the building was fun, and I feel the same way. The third is the connection to nature and the feeling that all things are connected together. Bruce was deceased by the time I ever knew of his name. I was still in high school, I think, when he passed away. And so Jim, in our early conversations together, told me who Bruce was. And through passages like that, really sort of shared that I have all the facts. I know where he went to college. I know his GPA in high school. I know all that stuff, right? But like the color, the context, all of that stuff was really in large part thanks to his widow, Janet Richards, and Jim himself. And I'm just fond of this picture. It's a young Jim, right? Just smiling, looking innocent. One of my great pleasures tonight is to show you a picture that no one's ever seen before. I know Laurel at Elon Lael has seen it. I know Dave Hampton has seen it. This is the first known window or project at all, ever, that Jim put in a Bruce Richards home. And it came to me very accidentally. I was going through notes in preparation for my evening with you tonight, and in our first meeting, Jim told me himself about this very piece of glass. And I know the people that own this house, and that glass does not exist. It is not part of that house. They've owned it for years, and it is not there. I don't know where it went. So in a separate project, not at all to do with what we're doing here tonight, I'm working with the daughter of this photographer. She lives in LA, and she manages her father's estate, all these photographs. And I said, can you send me a contact sheet or some proofs of stuff that Marvin Rand, the photographer, did in San Diego? And she sent me this image, and I stared at it, and I'm like, 20 years ago, I think Jim told me in my notes, oh, I did a window for this woman in Del Mar. And here it was just a few weeks ago, this landed in my lap. So I wanted to share that with you. It is the first known collaborative work. The collaboration came because Jim's mother, Julia, was pushing her son to get out in the world and to meet people. And he was, as Dave shared with us, some great pictures of the work he was doing at her home in Rancho Santa Fe. And she introduced Jim and Bruce by way of being Helen Essling's friend. So Helen kind of was the catalyst for the first project. And Jim told me, and I'm sure he's shared with many of you, right? Had it not been for Bruce putting him into a space where commerce was taking place, like he was getting paid to build this window to install it in a house, Jim's career may not have been as we understand it today. It may have taken longer to get jump-started. It may have happened initially in a different way. I'm sure of it that Jim would have landed and made everything he made thereafter, but I'm so excited to be able to share that image with you. My friend Jonathan Schmock still owns his parents' home, and one of the other people I interviewed about Bruce and Jim was Joyce Schmock. And this photo, which was published somewhere, it's a John Wagaman photo, is this amazing, it's almost a full floor height. It goes from the ceiling almost all the way down to the lower floor. And it's this wonderful sculpted light fixture that is, I guess, pieced together by some sort of rope or twine. And it's hard to share a lot of Bruce and Jim's work with you in this room on a TV set in a black and white photo, but believe me, it is the most awe-inspiring light fixture I think any of us have ever come across. But as 1960 is evolving, Julia Larea, his mom, Jim's mom, is down this other sort of interesting venture to launch the Wishing Well Hotel. Her son and Bruce design and collaborate on a series of buildings and a series of sort of the restaurant remodel. And there's a lot missing from this story, but Julia brought her son and Bruce Richards, the architect, to this spot in Rancho Santa Fe. And they did amazing, amazing things before it was torn down. And the funny part about it being torn down was a lot of the stuff that you're going to see in the next few pictures were dumpster dove away by fans of Jim's work. They all knew, all the homeowners and friends and family members and fans and neighbors of Jim Hubbell. They all kind of went and they heard about it was being demolished, and they tried to take as much of the fabric out of this demolition, and they put it in their own homes. And I came across the ownership of this secondhand material in other people's homes, and they would be so giddy to say, I was in the dumpster, I was on the construction site, and this is what I have to show you today. And I was like, this is so great. Now, there's a lot of missing pieces. I am not fully aware of everything, but what you're seeing in the background of these diners is the narrative of Jim's drawings of the Don Quixote story. These drawings also become a steel sculpture that dances between a couple of different physical sites. It lands in its last setting, or its most recent setting, in my home. It was on the fireplace. It was like this big steel mural that looks very much like some of these drawings in the background. It is now in the family's possession in Germany, but Don Quixote does play a significant role in sort of Jim's story. Jim did carvings and these wonderful resin panels. Bruce obviously was the architect of record, but I've seen color pictures. They have left my ownership. I'm desperately trying to find all these wonderful color pictures of the Wishing Well Hotel I've seen, because the black and white images really just don't do justice to it. As I learned, and I continue to learn about this story, when Dave was doing his talk from this very same podium a few weeks ago, these are the first known carved doors. So Jim, with his mom as the client, tried his hand at these very primitive, often chainsaw sculpted heavy doors. And they're flanked by these wonderful resin panels, very similar to that one at my entryway I showed you earlier. But these carved doors show up in a number of photographs that have sort of made it into my collection. Many of the images I still have, and I'll get to that in a minute later on in this talk, but I still have images of Jim's work, and I don't know where it is. I don't know who the client is. I don't know if it's still there, because I never knew where it was in the first place. But the interesting thing about the Wishing Well Hotel is I think it was a bit of an experimental laboratory. Having looked at some of the correspondence between Jim's mother and architect Bruce Richards about the design, it was very haphazard. There was like, well, let's work on that building for a while. Let's finish that building, and let's do the dining room. And then the dining room in the hotel lobby never really had a lot of guests, right? I've seen the menu, and I've seen they tried to do like readings and events there to get people interested, but the hotel restaurant never really took off. But what did interest me was, at least on 2 occasions, Jim and Bruce co-curated an exhibition of their work together. And it's the first time I know of them working collaboratively in an exhibition frame. There were exhibitions later, but the Wishing Well had a gallery, and it publicized in the local newspaper that they were doing exhibitions. And the Evening Tribune in 1961 wrote up one of those exhibitions, and they said, quote, "Though their artistic handshakes still seem casual, a possibility of their coming firmly to grip with each other does exist. Their philosophies expressed separately sound almost identical. Richards mentions having sympathy with the site, with the climate, the materials, and above all, with people. And Hubbell hoped his work would suggest the use of art in relation to architecture, nature, and above all, to man." And the writer in the longer article writes about interviewing them separately and being delighted that they basically said the same thing separately. And so Bruce was showing models and drawings and some photography of his architecture, and Jim was exhibiting a lot of multimedia work across different media. So it must have been an interesting show. To my knowledge, there's no photography of that exhibition record. We don't actually know what took place, but I was delighted that Julia, his mom, was sponsoring a lot of this early groundbreaking work. Here's a nondescript building in Prospect Street in La Jolla. It is not there anymore. It was called the Tyrolean Terrace. For those who've been around a little longer than I, you may remember this, the Pannikin coffee shop. The first Pannikin was on the ground floor, and Bruce's office was in the upper right corner. And Jim would come visit routinely at this office, and then later when he moves to Old Town, Jim would come and be social with Bruce at the Old Town office. But really interesting as far as collaborations and working together was one of the rooms, because it was an apartment building, right? One of the rooms in Bruce's office served as Jim's gallery. So Bruce had extra space, and he would invite clients and potential clients to come to his office on Prospect Street, and they could also pick up a piece of Jim's work. And there is a whole series of photographs. There are things that are not by Jim, but mostly the gallery is works. And some of them probably even look familiar. I believe there's a Kay Whitcomb enamel in there. There are these Japanese screens that look like Bruce may have borrowed them from his time with Frank Lloyd Wright. I use the word borrowed emphatically. There's works by Rhoda Lopez, the ceramist, and others, but really most of the inventory in the gallery were Jim's work. And it's just an unsung little moment that I find is part of this sort of like coming together. Like it's there's the genesis of what is to come by him hosting all of this work for sale. I've been really enamored with, so I'll just set the stage here because what we're going to go into next are just examples of where Hubbell's work is in a Richards building. What I try to do in the upcoming examples is a lot of houses. I mean, there's probably 2 or 3 dozen houses. The architect of record is Bruce Richards, and there's like a window or a door or a light fixture, right? And that's it. Like that client could only afford, like my earlier photo, that one window is all Helen Essling could afford in 1954, right? Other clients had a budget for art, or they had money left over after Bruce said, this is how much the house is going to cost, and they said, what else can we do? And what became fun and interesting and quirky maybe became the norm, right? People would say, well, you're done with the house, is Jim coming by to start adding artwork to it, right? And it became the two of them as a sort of a dynamic duo were known for this. But in the early days, I think it was fairly risky for a homeowner to hire this quirky architect and then adorn it or affix artwork to it. It's a wonderfully novel idea. And there's a handful of really amazing collaborative projects that the homeowner, the client, really just said, bring it on. And this is a photo by Bruce, which is sort of fun. I have a bunch of slides he took of projects, and I'll be sharing many of those with you for the first time, right, ever. So this is properly owned by Deborah Zake today. This is the Hayward residence in Mission Hills. In the early 60s. On the right, or the left-hand side, is a column, obviously carved by Jim. They are structural. This is integral to the structural componentry of the building. You can see the steel stair railing, the little square light sconce, which is indicative of almost every Bruce Richards entry. And then there's another post, which we're going to see in a second, and then there's the front door, which is carved. Throughout the house, there's additional sculpture, there's light fixtures. The house, I would say, originally had about 2 dozen works by Jim throughout. Some are still there. Most of them are still intact. This is just another vantage point where you can kind of see where that stair railing is affixed to. This is the inside of the front door. The sun was coming in, so I thought it was easier just to take a picture where you can see how the resin and glass is is just sort of illuminated by the light. The window to the right, in the right of the picture, which is to the left of you as you're opening your door, is actually a structural post that bisects the window. So the plexiglass, it's not glass, the plexiglass goes into the sculptured post, and it's beautifully like the UV has not hit the inside, and the outside of that sculptural post is weathered, right? So it's got this really fascinating duality to it. Jim adorned the fireplace. Bruce's fireplaces are a whole nother topic I could do a whole lecture on, but suffice to say, Bruce Richards' thumbprint, which is sort of that unique signature of all of his homes, was the fireplace. He would carry forward a lot of other ideas from house to house to house, but the fireplace was almost always as unique as your thumbprint. And here Jim adorned, like he did in a couple of occasions, this wonderful sculpture on the face of the fireplace, and then it kind of crawls up, and it actually is affixed to the ceiling as well. As I said earlier, Jim and Bruce, I call them by their first names. I hope that's okay with you. Were friends, right? And they hung out together. And this is a photo. Bruce is on the left. I believe Jim is in the middle, facing away from us. I can't tell. It's poor resolution on the slide that I scanned. But here they are in San Isabel at the Elan Lail property. And there's a whole series of these photos. And from an archival standpoint, I believe this is about 62, right? And Bruce is taking photographs of all of the buildings, all of the sculpture in the yard, in the landscape. Whether those sculptures were still there a year later, I'm not clear. Whether they survived the fire, I'm not clear. But it's a pretty great survey of what the property looked like at a moment in time. And of those pictures, this sculptural post, this columnar light fixture sculpture, has become really, really important to me. And I'm going to tell you in a couple more slides why that is. When you see it for the first time, it seems unique. But in the slides I'm going to show you in a minute, it becomes repeated. And that is almost like sort of Jim approaching production, right? Like carrying forth an idea in multiple iterations, which actually surprised me as I was preparing for tonight. I was like, oh, I have seen this before, not just at the San Isabel property. Jerry Crowley, who Marianne and Michael Gertis in their film Eye the Beholder spent a lot of time with the Crowleys, and if they're watching tonight, that'd be fantastic because they probably have one of the most substantial collections of. They took a Bruce Richards building envelope and then they kept the relationship with Jim. Most people, when their architect finishes their house, they end that relationship unless there's a lawsuit. But with the artist that Bruce introduced them to, they continue to go back to Jim and request additional works. When I went to visit them after the film was done, and I was enamored with what Marianne and Michael shared with me, you got to go to the treehouse in Los Altos Hills. And when I went there, I didn't really know beyond what the film represented, but it is a storage room of Hubbell. Like it's like everywhere you look, everywhere you would put your hand is another work by Jim, and it's pretty amazing. They probably spent more time with repeat viewings and repeat orders of more and more Hubbell product to adorn their wonderful house. And Jerry, in my conversations with Jerry, he said, they frequently used the music metaphor, where each would be playing a separate instrument or directing a different symphony, but they wanted to integrate the sounds together to make wonderful music and a wonderful experience. They did that together here for many years, and it was quite magical to watch. Jerry did bring Bruce back for additional remodels, but at that point it was pretty much the end of his time with Bruce, and the time with Jim just carried forward. So I'm going to just riff on that columnar sort of post. There's several of them at the Vint House in Del Mar. And having been at the Vint House just a handful of months ago, to see it still being enjoyed and loved, it's the one project that I think Jim was most proud of because it was an indoor-outdoor from stem to stern, where he put his work and Bruce's work integral together. These light fixtures that you come upon from the gate, the picture on the right is, there's a little kitty cat down there. You're at the street, and I will say you can't see much of the house from the street, right? You can kind of see the garage, but this is your welcome to a park. I have never felt anything short of calling this a park. Jim and Bruce called it the house with the sculpted garden or sculptured garden. And this wonderful rendering is by Jim. And quote, I think the garden space really is important because it's a way of taking the formality out of a building and also beginning to see the chaos of wild nature into our life. And that's one of the things we were trying to do very strongly. This was VJ Vint talking to me. I interviewed him many years after this project. He left the house and moved on with his life. But that house and the project of seeing the house and its landscape be built by these two men really changed the course of his life. He was in finance, right? Very logic-oriented man, but this very, very unusual landscape, park-like space really resonated with him. And he raised a couple of kids in this house, And there's pictures of them playing in this fountain, and you see there's these columns are just sort of, there's got to be, I think there's 5 of them in this one landscape alone. They all have that glass, that milk glass white globe at the top. It's kind of fun. There's more, there's posts. This on the left is sort of where you would hide your trash cans. It's next to the garage. And then on the right, you see another one of these, another vantage point of that column where the fountain was. As I said earlier, it was an indoor-outdoor project. I lost count of the number of artifacts of Jim's work are on site, but I would say it's probably, not counting every laid brick, right? I'd say there's probably, I don't know, 2 or 3 dozen works by Jim throughout the indoors and the outdoors. The black and white photographs were published. John Wagaman, the local photographer, did a pretty great survey of the landscape and the art. You can see his black and white photo, and then, as I mentioned earlier, looking through Bruce Richards' personal slide collection, I was able to get this little color photo, and I kind of put it as an inset just so you can see that the window on the right and that fixture, that pendant fixture coming from the ceiling, are just amazingly adorned in colorful glass and resin products, pieces. And then outside is a door, and then that same window from the outside. The amazing fireplace stack yields 4 fireplaces, 3 indoors, and this big, almost pizza oven-looking fireplace on the exterior of the building. Like any architect, especially of his era, Bruce was trying to look for solutions that were not wasteful, and so the same masonry column houses 4 separate fireplaces. And then in the landscape was this amazing, they're almost like islets. It's the most Gaudi looking reference point I've ever seen in San Diego outdoors, right? While people can probably label some of Jim's influences as Art Nouveau, this particular little patio setting, and of course, imagine being under that Torrey pine and then the Pacific Ocean. This is in Del Mar. The Pacific Ocean is really just it feels like a stone's throw away. It really is a bird flight away. I can't throw a rock that far, but it's quite amazing. Another of the clients that Bruce had that Jim came along for the ride were Paul and Parthy Engstrand. This house is kind of on the top of Mount Helix, and it has amazing views to much of the county. But for this instance, Bruce hires or includes Jim on the project to do this banisters, these balustrades. In some of the interviews, a lot of the clients called them spindles. They're basically lathe-turned spindles, like, you do like a baseball bat. Like I don't know if you've ever worked on a lathe. I don't know what the experience level of our audience is tonight. But while they are lathe-turned, they're all quite different. They don't match. It's mathematically hard to see how they relate to each other. But Jim would put numbers on all of them, so when they would arrive on a building site, there was a specific order. It wasn't mayhem, it wasn't chaos. He had them all planned in his head how they would be adjoining each other. So they're very interesting. The Engstrands got my favorite pendant light fixture in the planet. I love lighting, I look at lighting, I shop for lighting. I own lighting. Lighting is a really, really, really interesting thing. And they have this most wonderful sculpted entryway light fixture that I've ever seen. And you can see some of the sculpted balustrades and banister railings, the spindles off on the right-hand side.
What's that material?
It's like a resin, like fiberglassy material, and it's like shapely or shapeless. It's hard to really understand if there even was a reference point. And good friends of mine own this house, and they love when people come in and they look up, because it really is above your head as you walk in the front door. You've already walked past a Jim Hubbell door with door handles and resin windows. You've already had the Jim Hubbell sort of welcome, and then this smacks you in the face. It's just the most wonderful creation. And obviously this is a talk about collaborations, and so I wanted to show you an example of when Jim would collaborate on drawings, right? So this is, I don't know if you know University City, the All Saints Lutheran Church. There's this great little chapel, and basically it's just the building in the lower left corner. The larger building was never built, and the building on the right is the kindergartens, like preschool teaching rooms, right? But the chapel itself for the congregants is fairly small and fairly straightforward. This is a rendering by Kirk Breedlove, and that name's going to come up again. But this is a very, I think if you're somewhat familiar with architectural renderings, this is the presentation drawing to show the congregants, this is what your campus is going to look like. But subsequent to this drawing, Jim does a drawing. And it's like narratively completely different, right? I mean, I'll toggle just between the two just so you can kind of grasp it. This is based on the geometry in Bruce Richards' drawings, right? So he does these two-dimensional drawings, and then Kirk Breedlove, his draftsman, does this presentation drawing based on what those measurements would look like. And then Jim paints a picture for the congregants of this is where you're going to experience your faith, right? And it's wildly different. And the congregants, I think, were taken by this drawing versus, and Kirk's great. Kirk's like definitively doing his job, right? But Jim told the story. And I think that's a really rare moment because it's the only drawing I know of that Jim did for Bruce and Bruce carried to a client. There's lots of stuff to talk about, and I'm hopeful that you have questions and you're interested in the Q&A later. I used to live by San Diego State, and I used to walk my daughter to and from her preschool on the SDSU campus by this building, the Alpha Phi sorority. Bruce was the architect of it, but what you really notice from the street is what is called, it was nicknamed the Romeo and Juliet balcony. You can't do much more than wash a window from this balcony. I don't believe there were young women serenaded from this because it really is just a catwalk outside of a window. But it gives this idea that these young women would be serenaded by a gentleman caller, right, from another fraternity or the neighborhood. And yet when you look at the pedestals, the posts, the spindles, the lathe turned balustrades, they're very random. They don't seem to have a sense to them because the rest of the building is so ordered. Jim brought like the chaos, right, to the stage. And the front door is about as unique as a sorority gets in this town. I don't know if there's any sororities on the planet that have as cool of an entry court. But the hand-laid brick masonry, the sculpted front door, the glass, I mean, it's something that's so magical that I imagine after these young women graduate from college and they begin their lives away from San Diego State, some of this has to have residually stayed with them. It is my understanding, right? It's my hope that those young women that live and go through college experiencing this building probably come out the other side a little bit different and a little bit unique perspective than maybe some of the other sororities nearby. The Lepetsky house, all they could afford, these were school teachers, all they could afford was this one window. And it's not very much of a window. It's actually a sculpture of clay and glass fragments, right? It doesn't bring a lot of light in, but it does read like a work of art in this masonry wall. And then this great quote from Jim, I think we shared the same philosophy of life. I worked with a lot of different people, but Bruce was special. He was just a very human, very warm person, and besides learning about materials and working with craftspeople, the way he could work with a client and the way they became part of his family was really a profound thing for me to learn from him. When I work with a client, I first of all don't think of them as a client. They're a friend. I probably learned that from Bruce. It was hard for me to talk to Jim as an adult man, him, not me, and him say that he was so impressed by someone as an adult, right? Like, it wasn't a child rearing, like young, youthful experience that formed him as an adult. He was constantly giving credit to Bruce when Bruce was 23 years his senior, and they met Jim was probably about 23 or 4 probably when they first met, and yet he would constantly say to me in my interview time with Jim that he learned so much from this other man. And little was known about Bruce because he kind of built houses and not a lot of fanfare, but to hear Jim speak about him and how the mentorship was really profound really touched me. Again, lots of houses with just a light fixture. This was the only picture I've ever been able to find of this house because it burned down. This was it's right north of Cuyamaca Lake. It was sort of facing the lake, and you probably all remember that fire, right? It was one of the many things that perished. Another really, really big deal for me, client, is Dr. Larry Fine. Side note is, and I'll get to this later, but Larry was also Bruce Richards' eye doctor, right, which is sort of a sidebar at the moment. And again, Laurel's not with us tonight, but Laurel, who is the archivist with Elon Lael, has some great color photographs from she and I going over there a few months ago, actually probably about a year ago, and we took all these wonderful color photographs of this building, but the owners still live there, which is really awesome, right? And all this stuff is very well cherished and in good hands. And they couldn't be the right client to enjoy this for what is now 50 years. Is that right? 50 years? Doing the math wrong. 67, 60 years almost, right? 57, thank you. Sorry, someone's better at math. But all of this, everywhere you look, it's just a feast for the eyes and the senses. One of my favorite things that Larry told me, Dr. Fine told me, was that shag carpeting is in amazing condition. I'll just say that. And it just doesn't weather well with guests. He has reinstalled shag carpeting. And part of it is because the sort of acoustic qualities of shag carpeting have been lost on a lot of us that poo-poo shag carpeting. But he's an audiophile. He loves classical music. And all the shag carpeting, plus all this wood and all these sculptured posts, et cetera, by Jim and Bruce, the sound is dead. I don't know if you know that phrase, right? Like you clap your hands and there's no echo in any room in this house. It's really quite a thing for the senses, right? And Bruce was very much, as I alluded to earlier, all the senses had to be alive. It didn't have to be a good-looking house. It had to smell good. It had to sound good. It had to feel to your fingertips good. One of the other things, photography is I'll just say interesting, is my best adjective at the moment. But Jim is doing these structural posts, these sculpted posts. And when I was with Laurel in the house with Dr. Fine, he said the funny thing about Jim's sculpted posts was they arrive on his truck or someone's truck, and they're laying in the dirt when they first arrive. And he's like, oh God, what are these ugly things? He couldn't, even though he's the client, he couldn't picture how they were gonna fit in, right? And so he said, I think he went to the office and he's like, I don't know what's going on with that, but I'm just gonna go to the office, right? And he came home and they were obviously holding up the roof. They're actually integral to the structure, right? Is that he almost wept, right? He's like, how could I have dismissed this piece of sculpture just because it was laying on the ground, right? And I think Jim got a kick out of it. I know into my heart that Jim was like, I'll teach this guy, right? But in the sort of comedic nature of just moving it 90 degrees, it became the work that everyone wanted it to become. So Larry, Dr. Fine, incredible man, right? This is the office. And so Bruce does this little adobe and wood one-story office on Fifth Avenue in downtown, sort of like Middletown between downtown and Hillcrest. It was torn down 20 years ago, and it's a very large, very tall building today. But I was amazed, and I had this query with when we had time with Dr. Fine, like, why for an eye doctor's office did you go headlong into this amazing space? Rhoda Lopez did a fountain. The architecture is already like old California, like the ranchos. It's adobe and redwood and cedar. And then you go in the office, right? After you've gone through this plaza of like this maze-like entry, and this is your greeting. You're in the lobby to get your eyes examined. And this bounty of sculpted steel and glass and resin and wood is just amazing. This other vantage point shows you even there's more, right? At the different photographic angles, there's more. When the building was torn down, I have to say, Larry was, and still is, was the owner of all this. And so they dismantled all of this work, and it is now still in Larry's possession. As standalone sculptures, not even in the architectural context, they are quite amazing, right? Just aesthetically. But I was worried that the demolition caused these things, some harm or to disappear. But Larry's like, I'll show them to you, and he showed them. As really a treat. The Lion residence, and so we're kind of in the early 70s now. The Lion residence. I was just visiting Nancy a few months ago, and these very large totems, like they are almost of sort of a Native American or Inuit sort of class of these massive timber totems. And she just, she's still in the house. She's one of the original Richard's clients, original Hubbell clients, still in the home, and she's so proud. And she's like, they hold the roof up, right? Like, she's adamant to say these are not just decor, right? And it is important to look at that in context, because not a lot of architects out there in North America in the years following World War II were having an attaché as an artist, right? An artist was, along for the ride, and not just saying, okay, and Bruce said stuff like this, like, art should not just be something you put on a wall or you put on a coffee table, right? He was very, he had art in his home. He was an artist at his own home. But he would make these proclamations that would sort of rile up his audiences, like, art should not be, you put a nail in a rectangular oil painting. That's not art. Art needs to be part of the experience in the environment. And exaggerating or manifesting that fully would be a post holding up the ceiling, right? I mean, let's be honest. One favorite example of my time together with Jim was he called me up one day, and I can't remember which day of the week it was, but he would go to La Jolla and visit Liz Marshall, who is this woman in this picture. And so I sat with Liz Marshall and Jim Hubbell, and we had lunch, right? And what Jim had set this up for was me to interview Liz. She'd feel comfortable if he was there, and she would answer my questions. The entire transcript for that interview is all Jim talking. Liz would be like, yeah, yes, oh, yeah, yes. Like, Jim would recollect stuff, and she would just agree. She really felt, I think, cautious that she could actually contribute when she was sitting with the man himself. And I was asking about these questions, right? So here's this great photo, which I think sums up a lot of their relationship, is she's just laughing and smiling at the front door. It's carved by Jim. This is the silver residence that Bruce had finished about 15 or 16 years prior. But she's the second or third owner at this point, and she hires Jim to add a little bit of color and a little bit of texture to the house. And I look at this photo consistently. It's a photo that I'm very fond of. It just talks to me, speaks to me as San Diego architects, San Diego artists, part of a community, friends, right? Like, I feel like that's lost in a lot of when an architect hires a client and there's lots of money and there's lots of questions and things to think about. I look at this photo and I'm like, we should all just be friendly when we interact, even when there's commerce involved, right? I think we should be friendly with one another. So shortly after that, the Crowleys venture, as I mentioned earlier, on this amazing, amazing journey with both Bruce and Jim. And quote, this is from Nancy Crowley, they really worked so well as a team. From the very beginning, we could see that they respected each other completely, and they were in sync with each other's concepts about beauty and art. Bruce first told us he wanted to bring the outside inside. So when Jim decided to design so many beautiful pieces for our house, that was the concept he used as well. This concept of the outside and the inside is something that frankly is important to me because it's a temperate climate. We should be welcoming the indoors and the outdoors. I asked earlier if we could open up some of these windows and get some fresh air, but no, we are hermetically sealed in here together and there's no fresh air. So, when I was writing a book on Bruce Richards and when I've been lecturing on Bruce Richards or talking to people, I like to say, instead of lecturing, for some reason, the Liz Marshall Mobile Home Project is the coolest thing I ever experienced in this whole trajectory of learning about these men. It's a picture of Jim bringing a stained glass window to the site. De Anza Cove, sort of by Pacific Beach and Mission Bay, hosted a bunch of just ramshackle, standardized mobile homes. You may or may not have been there. You know what a mobile home looks like. A mobile home park is a replication of several mobile homes, right? Not very interesting. And for some reason, because Liz is who she was, and Jim and Bruce were who they were, they're like, we can't stand the idea of you just being in just a mobile home. So Bruce wanted to come by and smoke cigarettes, so he had a smoking porch. That's part of it. And then Jim made these amazing decorative panels and stained glass that I think are just I don't know. They just made this mobile home, or what Bruce called on the architectural drawings, the not so mobile coach. I think it should have been an award winner had Mobile Home Magazine ever come across it. But my good friend Spencer Lake was telling me this story, and I wanted to share with you. So obviously, you know Jim, in large part in his life, a stained glass, a producer of stained glass, right? So that's the headline. After Richards lost his left eye, it was about 1973, he swapped his white eye patch for a black one and eventually discarded the patch to reveal a glass prosthesis where his eye had once been. He had refused the masking solution. He wanted to meet people face to face. He would take life as it is. When he had to choose a glass orb for his missing eye, he talked of having Jim create a stained glass replacement. There is no better summary for these two men being friendly and being artists together. I mean, if you were visiting your Aunt Millie in one mobile home and then you saw across the way this project, it must have just been nothing short of remarkable, giddy. I'm sure she was the talk of the neighborhood. It's a sad statement when I went there years and years ago, and of course, it was not there. I don't know, how it was dismantled or what happened to it. So Kirk Breedlove, that guy who did that rendering earlier, who's in this little inset. It's the only photo I've ever been able to find of Kirk. He was very young. He was a draftsman. He was just out of college, and he was working in Bruce's office, and therefore he became friendly with Jim and all the folks that sort of happened through the office and the gallery on Prospect Street. So he was tragically killed in a car accident. And at some point, Bruce said, we need to pay homage. We need to create a tribute to this man. So what's been loosely called the Open Air Meditation Chapel, I'll get there in a second. It was at Trinity Church in Spring Valley. I have ventured over there over the years to try to find it, and I could never find it, right? And so the other day, just in prelude to getting ready for this evening, I finally had a long conversation with somebody at the Trinity Church, and she's only been there 19 years or something like that, and she didn't even know about this. So she ended up talking to some longer time congregants, and it was dismantled in the 90s. it's unfortunate because not only did I want to see it, and not only do we not have a lot of photographic evidence of what it looked like, but this is Bruce Richards, the architect, Rhoda Lopez, the ceramic artist, Bill Davey, the mason, and Jim Hubbell coming together to pay tribute in what was probably, I don't know, probably like a 30 or 40 by 40 space of land. The view that we're looking towards is sort of southwesterly of the church, and the congregants told me, and I was like puzzled. I'm like, why would you dismantle this? This just looks like a nice thing on the ground, right? It's not like going to hurt anybody. It's not going to tip over. And she said that teenagers, of course, were showing up in the dead of night on weekends when there were no church services, and they were cavorting and making noise, and all kinds of inappropriate things were happening. And as the church used to sit on this hill by itself, but the development of the residential neighborhood kind of encroached slowly and became closer and closer to the chapel. And so by the mid to late 1980s, there were homes right here. And there were 6-packs of beer strewn about and giggling until all hours of the evening. And they wanted to be a good neighbor. And they went through, there's lots of apparently church meetings, and there's notes at church meetings that describe congregants, saying, this is part of what we are. This is who we are, and part of it is but we don't want to be a bad neighbor. And so it took several years. It took something like 4 years of the process of these agendas in these church meetings to come to the resolution to dismantle it. So we're getting close to the end. I know you're all getting a little squirmy. Hopefully some people have some questions. I want to be candid here. I want to be honest. I have photographs on my computer, and I don't know what to do with them. I don't know what house, where they are, who the client was. This is just a smattering. I don't know where that door is. I don't know where that window is. I don't know where that light fixture is, and I don't but really want to find that stairwell railing. And if anyone, maybe on our live stream out there on the internet tonight, maybe here in the room, you say, oh, I remember going to that. But I have more. This is just a tip of an iceberg. There's still, Laurel and I talk about, like, where could these be? And eventually we will find stuff. But there's still a lot more of this journey to be had, and maybe I'll pass this on to someone else, and they'll be able to conclude some of these questions that still remain. So Bruce Richards dies in 1983, right? And so the recessions of the 1970s, the gas crisis, all the stuff, the post-Vietnam, the post-Nixon, all that stuff takes its toll, significant toll on architects, especially municipalities that suffer from these weird economics like San Diego did in the 1970s. But Louis Weinberg, who's a gasket king from Chicago, wants a weekend house in Ramona. And so he builds this wonderfully large, expansive house for just him and his wife across 3 big, large, granite-laid parcels in Ramona. And Jim is hired, obviously, to complement everything. Rhoda Lopez is hired to complement everything. And the house just sings of the relationship between Bruce and Jim and Rhoda Lopez. This bell, this sort of ornamental bell structure, it naively, I'll just say that, right? It looks to me like the bronze bells are scavenged from some yesteryear bell tower. I don't know if that's true or where they're from. But then Jim does this insanely wonderful housing where they float freely in the wind. They're not gonging like in the light breeze. They do take a pretty heavy crank to get them going, but they're wonderful. Jim did these gates. Rhoda did the ceramic column, and then Jim did the gates that flank the property. Jim did the front door and a ton of lighting, and I mean it's a laundry list of wonderful things that Jim brought to this site. But I just found the photo on the left yesterday. It was a slide taken by Bruce himself shortly after the door was installed. So on the right-hand side, you can see Rhoda Lopez ceramics surround the entryway. In here, it's basically just plywood. Rhoda has not shown up with her ceramic puzzle pieces yet. But the Weinbergs were really, really wonderful clients. And so were the Fergatches, Harvey Fergatch, who some of you may know that name from, he was a developer in the 70s mostly. 60s, 70s, made quite a imprint on this town. And Jim did a lot of the balustrades and banisters that run throughout the house, both indoors and outdoors. The only handicap here is that screen is not big enough to really just jump into the majesty of this photograph. It's pretty great. So all said and done, between about 1954 and 1983, when Bruce dies, are close to 30 years of productivity together. And the final collaboration is Bruce's memorial service in December of 1983 at All Souls Episcopal. I've always loved this photo. Those of you that have engaged in the church space, even for a moment, you just got to sit down, right? It pulls you to a pew to sit down and take in the sunlight coming through what might be Jim's most large-scale single wall facing one vantage point. Bruce did the rug that adorns the stage. Rhoda did that urn. It's a memorial urn that is a tradition that she carried forward in a lot of her ceramics. When people passed, she would do these wonderful memorial urns. And with that, I'll say thank you for sharing this time with me. It's such a obviously strange moment in our history together, but it's my hope that this helps us all remember those that have passed in really glowing terms, and we get to share it together tonight. So thank you. Because we're live on the internet right now, I don't know that we're going to take questions from anyone out there in Bulgaria. Questions from this room, if you want to speak out, I will repeat your question in the microphone so they can hear us. In the back, yes.
Sorry, speak loud. Hi, thank you. The pieces are so beautiful. I'm curious, the structural pieces like banisters, columns, wear and tear, exposure to the elements. Is there some kind of plan for upkeep or preservation? Something great? What happens?
That's a great question. So the question is, with all of this work being exposed to the elements, both indoors and out, how do owners and people maintain them? What is their lifespan? Thankfully, the climate that we live in Southern California is much less abrasive on wood than it could be elsewhere. That image of the Fergatch residence, it literally is on the sand in Del Mar, right? There are homes on the ocean front in La Jolla. They suffer from the salt air and the wind in addition to UV and regular rain and dew and all those things. My house, anybody that owns a wood house here in town, it is a constant battle against the elements to keep any element, alive, right? Bruce and Jim used a lot of woods that are hardier than you might think, and they have stood the test of time. The steel banister railings everywhere, they're not powder coated with some sort of rust resistant. They all suffer from oxidation, right, from sun and dew, et cetera, rain. I would say I've not been to too many sites where any of this work exists and suffered from oh gosh, come on, homeowner. I think they're all being lovingly cared for. I think everybody that owns one of these houses that has this integrated art is aware, right? This is not, oh, really? I didn't know, right? So they are caretaking for their homes and these art collections, very much so, yeah. Yes.
So by extension to that question, what is the implications moving forward? You know, as this generation is aging and these homes become hopefully passed on or hopefully cared for in some capacity. I mean, what's your experience been with, you know, purchasing some of these homes that people don't know what they have and remodeling them and not really realizing what's at stake?
I think I'll use Deborah Zake as an example because she's a friend. She went from one amazing house to another, and her current home is the Hayward residence that I showed you earlier, with a lot of Jim's work integrated to the structure. As a second owner, she bought it from the original family. She takes on that responsibility. I take on the responsibility owning the Richards family home myself. I think everybody that I'm aware of, for the most part, has caretaken the legacy and looks forward to the challenge and the opportunity of showcasing to friends and visitors when they come in to this house. When I showed you the Angstrand house earlier, my friend Annie that owns that house had posted on Instagram just the other day when she heard of Jim's passing, saying that, you know, I get to welcome people into this home and they witness this. She's the third or fourth owner, I can't remember, but her and her husband and their kids relish in bringing guests in, and they go, what on earth is that? Tell me more about, like, the house is structurally interesting. I'll get that, right? Bruce Richards is fascinating, interesting building envelopes, right? But then you add the magic of Jim's artistry, and it's just like, right? And so I think everyone that I've witnessed that is purchasing from an original owner, or in many cases, Bruce Richards' houses only have like 2 or 3 owners in their entirety since the 1940s or 50s. They're being lovingly cared for. It isn't without cost and time and effort and rolling up your sleeves. And so I think when people take on the ownership of any old home, an old craftsman, prairie-style home in Mission Hills, for example, it does take that time and attention every time. But this is just a little bit more. I know people have brought stuff back to Jim's workshop over the years to have things tuned up. So that's certainly an opportunity or an option for people that get flustered with their own inability to go to Home Depot and figure out how to keep that Jim Hubbell piece of work for another 50 years. Yeah. Yes?
The house I went to, when they had open house, Surf Song in Del Mar, you know that house? I have a video on
Okay.
that I did, and the owner, when he heard they were gonna do something weird, he said, I won't sell it. So
Yeah.
I don't know what's happened since, but I did a video of it, and it has tons of his work outside. It's beautiful.
I wonder if that's the same as the Vint house. I have a pet peeve, and this is not for anybody to really criticize me about. You're not allowed to criticize me about this. Is houses take on nicknames, right? There's the proper name on the blueprints, and that's always the name I reference. The Crowleys, they're great folks. Bruce said, hey, let's call this house the tree house. It doesn't say tree house on the drawings, it says the Crowley residence, right? But for 50 years, it's been the tree house, right? So I always use the reference of the client's last name, or on the blueprints, it actually says the name of the house. So Surf Song to me is someone renamed the house.
No, it's on there, and I have a video, and it's
Great.
Surf Song, and it's whoever did it, I don't know if he did it.
Oh, okay,
It's on the
okay,
plans.
okay.
It's called Surf Song in Del Mar, and it's on YouTube, and I did a whole video of it.
I'm curious. I don't know. Okay. Awesome. But it is common. I used to own a house by San Diego State, and people called it a cigar box. That wasn't actually the name, but that's what people called it, right? So. Questions? Yes, Drew.
Do you know the relationship of Ken Kellogg with Bruce and Jim, and how they came together?
Yeah, so the question for the internet is, how does Ken Kellogg fit into this trifecta, right? Because it is true. I spent a lot of time with Ken over the years, and obviously maybe you all know that the architect Ken Kellogg passed away recently as well. So Ken was in Colorado as an undergrad, and he grew up in Mission Beach. So in his summers back home in San Diego away from college, he was a draftsman and model builder for Bruce. So he was in Bruce's office a lot. So he obviously came in contact with Jim as early as Jim was involved with the Essling window. Like, this is 1954-ish, right? So Ken and Bruce and others, right, were engaged in this work and this conversation, and there was beer and there were cigarettes and there was burritos and tacos at the local cafe. They were friends. They were all friends. And Jim and Ken, closer in age than Bruce. Bruce was well their senior. And so Spencer Lake, who I mentioned earlier, Spencer was a Cal Poly San Luis Obispo undergrad at this point. And he came to San Diego on one of his summers away from college, and he witnessed this. And in 1965, he put an exhibition together that was Bruce, Jim, and Ken. And I have some low-res photos of that, and it's work from some of the houses I showed you, all trucked up to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Photos, drawings, models. It's this wonderful three-dimensional exhibition. And yet, this is 65, right? So Ken's earlier in his career. Jim's only a decade or so into his sort of full-time career. And then there's Three on the Edge, which was at Mingay, right? So there's another exhibition later that Ken and Jim and Wally Cunningham are involved, right? So there's that sort of larger genesis, right? From the 50s, drafting, model building. Ken becomes an architect on his own, and then they follow each other through these triad sort of like exhibitions. There's this interesting hypothesis that I've just recently engaged in this conversation where everyone has said Ken Kellogg is a Wrightian scholar, like he learned from Frank Lloyd Wright. He never studied with Frank Lloyd Wright. He met Frank Lloyd Wright and he read some books about Frank Lloyd Wright. But he didn't spend time with the world's greatest architect or whatever you want to call Frank Lloyd Wright. But when you take apart his buildings and you sort of step back and you take Frank Lloyd out of the mix, the genesis for a lot of Ken's ideas, not that Ken was standing on his own 2 feet as a designer, an amazing man, right? A lot of it is articulated through his experience through Bruce's office. And it took me 20-some years of looking at photos and drawings and visiting houses, and I only came to this realization with someone else's assistance. This was not on my own. And I'm endlessly more fascinated by this triad now than I was, because I thought he brought something from Colorado, but he actually brought something from Point Loma to Mission Beach. Like but Ken's work is sort of like if Bruce would have had bigger clients with bigger budgets, he might have approached some of the stuff that Ken Kellogg was able to accomplish in his career. But this newfound hypothesis that Ken's took his time with Bruce Richards and grew it is really profound, and it's really homegrown. I like the fact that Frank Lloyd Wright may have not had as much of an influence, because I like San Diego. I like San Diegans. I'm a big booster. And so I've been really heartened by this more recent sort of discovery. Yes?
On that note, can you talk a little bit about Bruce's influence from Frank Lloyd Wright?
Yes.
And some of us may or may not know more about that.
Yeah. So the question is, what is Bruce Richards' influence and/or connection to Frank Lloyd Wright? And here's like a pet peeve like headline, right? Like, and then I'll answer your question. Imagine if you were an architect and you had decades of work under your belt, and people are like, oh, you're the Frank Lloyd Wright guy. You'd be like, oh, come on, like I'm on, right? And to this day, every apprentice, there's 700 plus people that were at Taliesin before or after Frank Lloyd Wright was deceased, right? But they were in that school setting. They all suffer from being the guy that was with Frank Lloyd Wright, right? Or learned from, right? So, but that said, they were all with Frank Lloyd Wright for months, not years mostly, but generally months, right? Bruce was there just shy of 2 years. And a lot of his work immediately after looks like Frank Lloyd Wright. It's just like templates, right? But the longer you get away from your time with Frank Lloyd Wright or architecture school, any architecture school, you learn who you are, right? And so they graduate from that. But a lot of it, like when Bruce would get interviewed in the 70s 20 odd years after he was, no, 40 years after he was with Wright, they'd still like, oh, you're like the Frank Lloyd Wright guy in San Diego. And he'd be like, oh my gosh, right? And there were a half a dozen architects that left Frank Lloyd Wright that came to San Diego, and they all suffered from that to some degree. But the ones that shed it quicker were only known as architects. Bruce, he kept that woodsy aesthetic, and so he kept saying, oh, Frank Lloyd Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright. But I would say Bruce graduated from that, as many of Frank Lloyd Wright's apprentices did, and did really good work on their own, of their own creative efforts, right? But it is somewhat true that, like, if you see in a real estate listing, it says like Frank Lloyd Wright apprentice, or understudy of, or acolyte of, or student of. It's like, it's a shorthand of weighing of, I don't have time in this little field to explain, but like, okay, Frank Lloyd Wright, right? And it is one of those things that few of us in the world know much more about architecture than, oh, that looks like Frank Lloyd Wright. We don't know the mechanics and the difficulties of being an architect, right? So it's a really great shorthand. But Bruce brought this wood and glass aesthetic. I've been quoted as saying they look like modern cabins, like mid-century modern, like architect-designed cabins. It's a shorthand I use to say when you're in the home, it's a lot of wood, right? And you got to deal with that, right? But Bruce was only with Frank Lloyd Wright for like 20 months, and he was in his 20s, right? So it's sort of like, I don't want anyone to say, oh, you were a communications major at San Luis, UC Santa Barbara. Well, that's the rest of your life, right? I'd be hamstrung by that, and so that's, anyway.
Thank you for that. That was great.
Sorry for going long in the tooth, internet. Yes, Bonnie in the back.
Yes, we have an online question.
Whoa.
Can you hear me okay? All right. To which extent were these projects done in collaboration? Did Jim and Bruce conceive their creations together, or would Jim add this creation to Bruce's once the architecture was already in place?
Oh, God. Well, that should have been the whole lecture. Great question. So the question is, how would you define the collaboration? Was one starting and the other finishing? Were they doing it all together? I did not know this until I looked at almost every architectural drawing that the San Diego History Center has in their archive in prelude to the exhibition I did on Bruce Richards last year. I literally went page by page, thousands of drawings. Just took it all in, right? Never once did I say, Jim, do something here, right? Or Jim articulating in the drawing that the thing that I know is there now was not there in the drawings. So my understanding would be, to sort of synthesize these collaborations, was Bruce would basically design and sometimes even start construction. And then Jim would show up and he'd be like, what could I do here? They would add value, right? Not replace or take away from, but it had to add something. And the interesting thing about my analogy or my story with Larry Fine seeing the column on the ground is no one knew what Jim was up to until they saw it in front of them. That is my understanding of that collaboration. But because they trusted each other so implicitly, and Bruce, as an architect, fostered his clients to be like, whatever you guys want to do, like, bring it on. That's so rare, right? And so this implicit trust that an artist would show up and make your house better was purely based on implicit trust in the architect and or the artist, or having witnessed what they had done elsewhere. And that's magic, right? I mean, there's nothing short of using the M word, right? It doesn't exist anymore. You don't hire Rob Quigley, who's a fascinating architect who lives right down the street, and you say, oh yeah, I don't know, some artist is just gonna show up midway through construction and do a bunch of stuff on my house or my commercial building. It's like a lost art form or something. Like, it's something that's like speaks to yesteryear, because implicitly architects and clients often start from a litigation standpoint. Like, how do we minimize risk in litigation versus, I want to have joy every time I eat my breakfast. And I want the sun to come through this stained glass and hit my eggs every morning. And that's magic, right? It's something almost that these people were so unique on this planet that they could bring that to the table. It's mind-boggling. Yes, it's beautiful, and it was affordable. I mean, I've seen some of the invoices. I'm like, okay, stained glass window, $75, right? But like, just the fact that I don't ever see it in the drawings, and then it shows up in the house, I'm like, and then there are only a few homeowners that are still alive. Very few of them are still in their homes, and when I speak with them, they're like, oh, they just have this fond memory of it all working out. I'm like, how does that work in today's world, right? It is small town San Diego. It's two quirky guys that were like singing and playing classical music and enjoying each other's company. And they show up, I don't know if Jim had a pickup truck, but I envision a pickup truck full of stained glass and resin and a door cut up with a chainsaw. And the homeowner's like, oh, okay. I mean, it's just beautiful. It's just beautiful. And it's about 7:30, so I think that's about it. Thank you all.
This is Surf Song. There's the name of it. I can't read.
Oh, wait, that's John Lloyd Wright.
Okay. So then they had an open house, and I did a video, that's all.
So these are the drawings?
Yeah.
I'm just...
That was, that's all I I'll show you that. So if,
That drawing looks like John Lloyd Wright.
okay. And then, so
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
You can watch the whole video.
Okay. Castles in the Sand, Deirdre Jones, James Hubbell, Surf Song.
So, and I'm singing on it.
Oh, cool.
So, but anyway, it's all inside the town, all the different work. So anyway, you haven't been to that house?
I don't believe I've ever been invited.
Stop it and make stills if there's anything.
Yeah, I will.